Fort Niagara, also known as Old Fort Niagara, is a fortification originally built by New France to protect its interests in North America, specifically control of access between the Niagara River and Lake Ontario, the easternmost of the Great Lakes. The fort is on the river's eastern bank at its mouth on Lake Ontario. Youngstown, New York, later developed nearby. The British took over the fort in 1759 during the French and Indian War, although the United States ostensibly was ceded the fort after it gained independence in the American Revolutionary War. The British stayed until 1796. Transfer to the U.S. came after signing of the Jay Treaty that reaffirmed and implemented the legal border with British Canada. Although the U.S. Army deactivated the fort in 1963, the Coast Guard continues to have a presence. A non-profit group operates the fort and grounds as a state park and preserves it, in part as a museum and site for historical reenactments. It is also a venue for special events related to the region's history.
my head is made of wool, and it is not very good at blocking the sunlight, keeping me warm. It is very good at catching rain that I then have to dump out of my hat, but it is a gorgeous looking hat, and it was very much a fashion statement because the armies are always looking good at the time. The juste corps that I am wearing is made of wool. The long-sleeved vest that I have underneath is also made of wool. I'm wearing a linen shirt, a linen necktie, wool breeches, wool stockings, and because I am in garrison, I am not wearing my full-length leg gaiters, which then protect my wool stockings. Those would have been made of linen. And I am wearing leather buckle shoes that have no right or left foot, and it is, in fact, as uncomfortable as it sounds. Altogether, I am wearing about, 10 to 15 pounds of wool, depending on the day and how much rain I absorb. But it is a pretty heavy uniform, and this is a uniform that you are wearing year-round. Works great for Europe with a very temperate climate, but when they got to North America, they realized they started to need to make some changes to the uniform. One of the big changes that the French made, they didn't give us any less wool, but the hatchet that I am carrying, that would have been a 3-foot-long sword. Now, this sword isn't meant for fighting. It is called a hanger. It literally hangs there. It is essentially a giant butter knife, and all that was a sign of prestige and fashion, much like my hat. Not a whole lot of practicality in that. So the French, unlike the British, were a bit more receptive to the Native Americans' way of life. So they realized maybe walking through the woods with a 3-foot-long useless sword on your side isn't really the best idea. So they adapted carrying a hatchet, which is not only a weapon, but a very, very, very useful tool. Speaking of useful tools, this is my smoothbore Charleville flintlock musket. There are 3 big components to this thing. We have our lock, where all the action happens. We have our wooden stock, and we have our barrel. So lock, stock, and barrel, where the expression comes from. Just means you have everything in one neat and tidy package ready to go. So, how this works. There is a little piece of sharpened flint stone in the mouth of what the French thought looked like a dog. So this is called le chien. The British thought it looked like a rooster. And that is why, to this day, we still cock a gun. So, that sharpened piece of steel should fly forward and hit my hammer, hopefully causing sparks, because flint is much harder than steel. Now those sparks should land in the pan here, which will have a small amount of black gunpowder. Now that small amount of black gunpowder should explode. And that small explosion should hopefully carry through to the main charge inside the barrel. And that should hopefully explode and then send my musket ball flying out towards, in my case, the British. A lot of shoulds, a lot of maybes, a lot of hopefullys. These are not the most accurate and reliable weapons in the entire world. They do not like to work in the rain, the sleet, the snow, the wind, the dark, because we're using black powder. We basically would have waited for a nice, clear, windless, beautiful day like today to have battles, because otherwise the guns wouldn't work. And even on a beautiful day like this, it still might not work. So bear with me if this thing doesn't go off the first time. We will make it go boom at some point. Now, the actual loading process, I will reach into my cartridge box to grab a cartridge. Now this cartridge will have everything I need to fire the weapon. It will have my gunpowder charge in there, along with a musket ball. We're not using real musket balls today. That is very bad for repeat business. So it is a blank, do not worry. And it will have a 64 caliber musket ball in it. This is a 69 caliber bore. Now, there is a pretty big difference between the musket ball and the barrel. They did that on purpose. being a smoothbore flintlock musket, it has no rifling in it. And they did have rifles at the time, and rifling, all that is a spiral groove inside the barrel. It allows to stabilize the musket ball for a nice straight line of travel through the air. These being smoothbore, the ball kind of rattles around inside. It can go flying up in the air, right into the ground in front of you, to the right, to the left. Hopefully, it is going to hit somebody on the other side of the battlefield. Now, they didn't have rifles at the time, and you may be asking, why aren't we using the rifles if they're so much more accurate? A couple big reasons for that. First big reason, and the king's favorite reason, is this is about 1/3 the cost of a rifle at the time. Another big reason, this is able to be loaded and fired in 15 seconds by a well-trained soldier. That was to prove competency. So you're looking at about 4 rounds a minute. A rifle at the time takes about a full minute to load and fire, one single shot. You have to be able to work the ball down through the rifling, get it nice and tight, where this, because the ball is so much smaller, I can throw it in, ram it down in that 15-second time frame. And the other big reason we are using muskets instead of rifles is, see that black gunk that builds up? That is called fouling. And that fouling will build up to the point where I can no longer shove a musket ball down the barrel. I can fire about 60 to 70 shots before I actually have to stop to clean this thing in order to shoot anymore. Rifles at the time take about 10 to 15 shots before they are so gunged up with the black powder residue that you have to stop and then clean it. Now, onto the actual loading. You may notice that my hands are full and I need to rip this open. How am I going to do that? My teeth. One of the requirements of being a soldier back in the day was to have 2 opposing teeth. So I can rip it, and then spit that at my enemy to show my distaste for them. Then I'm going to pour a little bit of black powder into the pan here. I am then going to close the hammer upon it to make sure it doesn't fall out as I cast the musket about to pour the remaining charge down the barrel. Now, because that musket ball is so much smaller than the bore, if I ever have to point this downhill, the ball will roll out. So I want to be sure to twist the paper around it to give it that extra little bit of wadding to make sure that this thing isn't going to be completely useless. I am then going to withdraw my baguette, as the French call it, or rammer, as the British call it. Ram down the charge, withdraw my rammer, or baguette, and be sure to return it, because it may seem like a fun flying spear of death, but really all it's going to do is maybe do a couple loop-de-loops in the air and land about 30 feet in front of me, and now all I have is a very expensive club. So, my musket is now ready to be fired. I will let my officer know that by bringing it to the shoulder position here. And the French will go through the commands of haute les fusils, which means bring it up here. Apprêter les fusils means bring it back to full cock position. And then en jeu, which does not mean aim, by the way. These things are not the most accurate things in the world. Aiming at that cannon right there, I could probably hit that maybe 1 to every 3 to 5 shots. So to remedy that, we take hundreds of our best friends, put them in a big line, take turns shooting at each other. Sounds pretty silly, but because these aren't the most accurate things in the world, you're not mowing down lines of troops. You will see in the American Civil War, when they were still using linear style tactics, the casualty rates were extremely high because they were using much more accurate weapons at the time. And that's when they started realizing, oh, maybe we shouldn't stand in long lines and shoot at each other because, hey, now everyone's getting mowed down in one single shot. So, let's do this for real. Haute les fusils. Apprêtez les fusils. En jeu. Now the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, fire. Oh, you just my foot. So, I'm sure you noticed that smoke that this thing produced. That is very important because imagine that times 2. We were using pretty much only half a charge in these lengths. And then imagine that 2 times 100 or 1,000. Add a few artillery pieces on there, and the battlefield becomes a very, very, very smoky place. So, we're not so much worried about seeing the enemy at the time. We know they're about 100 to 200 yards in front of us, but what we are very, very worried about is shooting our buddies in the back. So, how do we remedy that with all of this smoke? We put everyone in big, bright, beautiful sport coats so that we can see each other. There's really no point in camouflaging at the time. The guerrilla warfare tactics were seen to the European officer's mind as dishonorable. They were following these rules of war. So we were very much concerned with seeing where everyone was as opposed to trying to hide from the enemy and sneak around them. Now, this 18th century linear style warfare was essentially a giant shouting match between the two armies. Like I said, going back to the inaccuracies of this thing, you're not hitting everybody every single shot. So your goal is to essentially decrease the morale of the enemy side. When you start seeing them misfiring, tripping over each other, falling all over, your officer will then tell you to break out the most feared weapon on the 18th century battlefield, the triangular-shaped socket bayonet. You will see that it is, in fact, triangularly shaped, and that is for no other reason than stability and strength. These metals were not the metals we have today, and so they needed something that wasn't going to break easily. And as I'm sure you've seen, this is not the most sharp thing in the world. This is left on the front of the gun the entire time we are fighting. So if you're trying to reload, you don't really want to be slicing your fingers. And a result of this being very dull is it does not create nice, clean cuts. So it is essentially ripping its way through a body. And remember that black powder fouling I talked about earlier? That is now built up on the bayonet. And black powder at the time was made up of 3 key ingredients: charcoal, burnt wood, not exactly fun to get in an open wound, sulfur, that yellow smelly rock from the ground, quite flammable, and saltpeter, known today as potassium nitrate. Back in the day, that was made by boiling cow manure with pee. Yeah, so now you have an opened, jagged wound with cow poo in it. Not exactly a good way to go. So that is what made this thing so incredibly feared. So that is why when you see thousands of guys marching at you with these things at throat level, the battle's pretty much over, much like this musket demonstration. So if you have any questions about anything you've seen, what I'm wearing, about the gun, anything at all, I would be happy to answer them as best I can.